There are several parts of Enter Electro that I feel were done way better in the first Spider-Man PS1, so it's a bit tedious when the villain slips away for the upteenth time. The same can't necessarily be said about how the game plays, however, but by 2001 it was simply egregious. Walk with a lot. Please tell me this is web. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, does whatever a spider can. And also Mary Jane, but I'm Tish. So in spite of my mixed feelings with Spider-Man PS1, it's no doubt that it was a unanimous success both critically and commercially, so in the dying days of the PS1, October 19th, 2001, actually scratch that, the PS1 was already dead, Activision decided that they wanted to have one last big PS1 game under their belts for whatever reason, so decided to make a sequel to their hit Spider-Man game from the previous year, in spite of the PS2 already being out and subsequently holding the entire industry hostage from sheer success for fucking years. But Neversoft was moving on to bigger and better things, so what do you do to a franchise that's past its prime but the publisher won't give up, specifically in this case Activision? Hand it over to Vicarious Visions, of course, the perennial, hey, we're done with this but you can have it developers. It's interesting to note that while the previous game was a multiplat, this game was exclusive to PS1. Methinks it was a God of War 2 situation where it was already being made during that grey area after the next gen had started but before it was fully established, and the PS1 was the only 5th gen console with even slight relevance by late 2001. It probably would have gotten a Dreamcast port, but by this point the Dreamcast was slightly less than worth developing for. In spite of it being made for a dead system, it still somehow managed to sell over 1.5 million units, still about half of what the previous game sold, but that really goes to show you the brand power of Spider-Man even to this day, and I suppose the power of backwards compatibility. Funnily for me, I never strictly speaking owned this game growing up, but I might as well have. You see, I had a family friend that would lend it to me for months at a time, so I got the full experience of owning it, but after I gave it back to him for the final time, it would be something like 10 years before I thought, "Hoobadoo, hey, that there Spider-Man game was good, I should get it, hoobadoo-badoo." So I bought it, played it, and I had mixed feelings about it pretty much immediately, but then again, this was also after I played the first Spider-Man PS1 game and thought it was a big banger, so have things changed? Well, let's take a look and see. So let's take a look at Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro, but let's not see if it passes the nostalgia test, because this game, unlike the first game, was a game that I dealt with during my childhood. So let's do the next best thing, and see if it's a game that's still good, or if it's another case of me satisfyingly killing my childhood. Hey! Why don't you die? So first things first, the title. Spider-Man 2, Enter Electro. That has to be one of the worst subtitles I think I've ever heard. Why? Enter Electro. They don't even need to change the name for the porno parody, and that makes me laugh so hard I puke. It almost seems like they wrote the title as if it was part of a script, like, Spider-Man narrowly defeated multiple foes en route to saving New York. Enter Electro. I don't know, maybe it's a title that sounds a lot cooler if you're not as cynical or jaded as me, but man, I can't help but wonder what they were thinking. But at least I can make this joke.
With a wave of my finger and a flick of my dick, one zap from me will kill you quick, so get on your knees to suck and blow, but not right now, I've got to go!
Unoriginal? Me? Irrelevancies aside, I can't decide if I love this game or hate this game. It's just a very conflicting game right from the beginning. I remember seeing a review of this game from years ago that sadly no longer exists, where the reviewer in question named it his most disappointing game of all time simply because he found it boring, lacking many of the more exciting aspects from the previous game, including chase sequences and harrowing crawls through the sewers. While I'm not going to disagree that this game has less fast-paced action about it, I was already conflicted about the first Spider-Man PS1 game, including the aspects that he mentioned he was disappointed that they took out. That said, there are several parts of Enter Electro that I feel were done way better in the first Spider-Man PS1 game and vice versa, so this is going to be a tough one to boil down, but this game seriously does make strides to try and improve itself. Graphically, for example, there's nothing much to say other than it looks as good, if not slightly better than the first game. This game reuses assets from the previous game, and anything new is basically the same level of graphical fidelity from Spider-Man PS1. The only real change that I noticed on the surface is that Spider-Man's base design is much closer to that of his original appearance, appearance. That is to say, he has webbing in his armpits, which is pretty weird if you ask me, but for what it's worth, this game does look on the upper end of games on the PS1 spectrum. You have some pretty vast and quite frankly impressive true-to-life environments, or as true-to-life as you could get in this era, that look and feel like actual parts of a city as opposed to a series of floating buildings. The in-game models are nicely detailed, even though we once again have the problem of a few too many clones and not enough variance to the basic enemy numbers. Otherwise, this game feels like the pages of a comic book coming to life, from the saturated colors to the goofy animations, such as with things like the explosions, which are the same circular orange explosions every time, which are so comic book-esque that you could practically see the boom graphic. Indeed, though, the models when in motion are well animated and richly detailed. The skyboxes are colorful. Overall, this game is a treat to look at, and there's something interesting I noticed graphically as well. The entire game kinda has this Kirby's Adventure-esque passage of time where every level feels like a few hours after the last. This game goes from sunset through the night, back to evening of the next day, through the next day, then it goes through that cycle again, finishing on the sunrise of day 4. In fact, kinda like Majora's Mask. And didn't they both come out in 2001? Though I think there may have been a day cycle between the Sandman boss fight and the museum level. It's a vestigial detail, but it's something that I really appreciate because I like to actively feel the passage of time in investigative games like this. It's just neat. Plus, I'm a sucker for a good sunset, which is something that this game has in spades. The FMV cutscenes, though, once again, they didn't even try to add facial movement. Thankfully, there's nothing as bad as Rhino's big goofy grin, but there's still no facial movement, even when you can clearly see their faces, not even a texture change. I'm surprised, too, because they managed some impressive effects, like Sandman's particle physics or Electro's mask.
If nothing else, I can at least learn the Flash's secret identity. I have no idea who this is.
So facial animation aside, these cutscenes are very impressive. The animation is stellar. This game had no business being on the PS1 in late 2001, but it also has no business looking this good. Give it a halfway decent upscaling, and I could see this game looking as good as an early PS2 game. Continuing on the list of things this game does better than its predecessor, narratively, this game does exactly what I thought it should do, and rather than a bunch of barely connected stories that justify gameplay, it's now a series of very connected stories that justify gameplay. What I mean is that there are a bunch of different story threads that deviate from the primary core, but they're always somewhat connected to the central core, unlike before. Fucking score. So this game starts out right after the first game, right down to the opening shot being a recap of the first game, as well as starting up with the same newspaper headline that the first game ended with. So with Doc Ock and his merry band of misfits locked up, Electro breaks into a lab and steals some sort of mysterious device, then escapes, causing rolling blackouts across the city. Not much is told to you at the beginning, but it's presented in a very intriguing way. You discover what's going on alongside Spider-Man himself, so it's written in a very natural way. The basic plot is that Electro and his merry band of misfits are robbing a whole bunch of science labs to construct a device meant to amplify one's own bioelectrical energy. In the hands of a regular being, it could amplify your bioelectrical energy enough to power a city block. In the hands of Electro, it could basically turn him into the god of electricity, which is funny because we already have a god of thunder in this universe. They even reference him. So why Spider-Man would even need to defeat him at that point is still a mystery to me, but we get ahead of ourselves. I find this story basically as good as it could have been for what it was. High praise, I know, but given the setup, it had a ceiling, and the ceiling was certainly hit. The framing device of Electro stealing a device meant to amplify one's own bioelectrical energy is the exact blend of soft science, compelling ridiculousness that I love in my comic book stories, and Enter Electro owns it. This game is ridiculous, and the game has fun with that. Like, there's this one level where Electro is enacting his big plan, so to deal with Spider-Man, in the meantime, he brings a whole bunch of samurai armor sets to life with his electricity powers, which is just great. It's no Shakespeare, but it's a comic book story, so it's not really expected to be. Unless you're called Logan. Or the Dark Knight. Though I've never really been the biggest fan of The Dark Knight. Come at me, bro. And structurally, Enter Electro I feel has a much better pace compared to its predecessor. Everything you do in this game, from disabling a bomb to breaking into a science lab to dealing with street-level thugs, are all unquestionably tied into the main plot in some way, so it feels like one continuous cohesive adventure rather than a string of disconnected stories like the last game did. But that comes with its own string of issues. The main one being that this game feels like a glorified MacGuffin hunt for a good portion of it. You find a robbery in progress, then you chase after the culprit, but there are things that keep getting in your way in the meantime. Villains, a bomb, a runaway plane, machine guns, and so on. So it's a bit tedious when the villain slips away for the upteenth time, though things start to get better in that regard once you get to the ball where you fight Hammerhead. After that, it becomes a series of things happening in aid of the plot rather than a continuous thing that happens in aid of the plot, which is still better than a series of things happening for their own sake, if you see what I mean. As I implied a minute ago, I don't really see how else they could have done this, so 1/3, maybe 2/5 of the game being tedious, that's very livable. The rogues gallery you deal with this time is kinda conflicting. After the first game used up pretty well every single A-list Spider-Man villain other than the Green Goblin, as well as most of the B-list, they were scrounging around to try and find a halfway decent villain lineup, so you end up with the titular Electro as the main villain. Then you have Sandman, the Lizard, the Shocker... The Shocker?
Hey, Spider-Man, I'm gonna fucking kill ya, and I'm gonna do it with 3 fingers.
Then you have Hammerhead, and this game's equivalent of the Submariner in terms of name brand recognition as well as relevance to the plot, the Beetle. It's not the strongest lineup of villains, but they worked well with what they had, and the plot establishes Electro to be a very capable villain with a great devious personality. I feel like they were probably anticipating a third game being made, which would probably have included the Green Goblin, the Vulture, Kraven, Hydro-Man, and maybe Morlun. These games are certainly campy enough to have these characters fit, and I would have loved to see what they could have done with these characters in this series, but they probably weren't anticipating the Tobey Maguire movie coming out and ruining any chance of there being a third game in this continuity, at least when development started. I have a feeling like this game may have been a bit rushed, because you don't really get much interaction with the Marvel Universe unlike the first game. Beast plays the same role as Black Cat in the last game, and you get fully powered Rogue and Professor X in the optional tutorial missions, but that's pretty much it as far as extended Marvel Universe goes. I would have loved to see this game's take on Iron Man, Thor, Wolverine, or hell, maybe even Deadpool. No such luck. A shame, because that was one of the highlights for me last time, though Thor was meant to appear in the game, but I'll talk more about that when I cover the ending. In regards to what we did get, there are quite a few compelling moments throughout the game. The plot point of Dr. Connors being one of the scientists working on the device was well done, especially when he relapses, turning back into the Lizard, which is quite frankly harrowing. A bit convenient on the timing, but it ties everything together really well. Hammerhead and his gang of 30s goons was hammy as hell, but very entertaining, especially Hammerhead himself, who almost reaches campy overload with his ridiculous 30s era gangster accent and personality.
Tomorrow night, the good doctor will be attending the Science and Industry Ball. I'm gonna get the doctor myself, but I get nowhere unless the team takes out Spider-Man. Spider-Man!
He's just great. I also strangely love the game over sequences. Sometimes it'll just be the generic continue screen, but other times it'll show you the Daily Bugle report, hilariously defaming Spider-Man after a humiliating defeat, while also containing a sub-story about how screwed we all are. This actually brings me to a question I have. So, in the comics, right? Did Spider-Man ever sue the Bugle for defamation? Because the running theme in that regard, or at least with J. Jonah Jameson and his raging hate boner, is that they're constantly constructing malicious hit pieces out of fabricated lies and blatant false facts in an attempt to further their own malicious agenda. Not unlike HBO. In terms of drawbacks, I thought Spider-Man conveniently finding an invitation to the ball was a bit contrived. I have a feeling that they probably had more in mind to do with the Beetle here that was cut, because he only appears in the story to accidentally spill the beans about the ball before disappearing into the ether forever. It's not made clear if the police are after Spider-Man at one point because he technically broke into biotech, or if he's still wanted after the events of the last game. A nitpick, but still. Also, the game's main MacGuffin requiring a fist-sized gem, only for one of the world's biggest sapphires just happening to be on display at a local museum at the exact same time, is super contrived. It's a means to an end, but there should have been a better way that could have been comparatively captivating and lead to similar levels, like maybe having someone stumble across the museum of famous jewelry or something, you know, so it's not just an exhibit that happens to be going on at the exact same time. Also, I made a remark about how there were 2 female characters in the last game and their entire roles were to be kidnapped whether they needed to be or not. Well, now this series is 3 for 3 in that regard, as the only female character in this entire game's entire purpose is to be kidnapped for information on the BioNexus device, and later as a wager for the gem that Electro uses. And of course, she accidentally costs Spider-Man that as well. You are congealed useless! I'm sure this has more to do with how women were treated in comic books back in the late 90s and early 2000s in general. I mean, I know White Knight, but apparently neither were these guys. There was lip service to her being Elektra at one point, but that was a joke. Maybe they should have put Elektra in this game, as that would have at least broken the streak. I'm not even particularly invested in this topic, it just continues to baffle me. That said, the build-up to fighting Electro on crack is great. He's beaten a bit too quickly, but it does feel properly epic to fight a godlike figure. Seeing as you unlock the battle-damaged costume whether you like it or not in the first fight with Electro, that establishes how much the first fight took out of Spider-Man and how in over his head he is going into the rematch, which also communicates non-verbally that Electro is a much bigger threat than anything we saw in the first game, so laying the smackdown on him feels properly built up with strong overall payoff. Plus, last time you went toe-to-toe with a juiced-up Doc Ock and had no choice but to run for your life, but now you're going toe-to-toe with a literal god and holding your own, which is either a non-verbal communication as to how much stronger Spider-Man has gotten over the course of these 2 games, or maybe is just a massive contrivance and borderline plot hole. I haven't decided yet. So the plot setup is wacky and over the top, but is compelling and is told with a surprising amount of conviction, and the pacing is decent. The villains are good in spite of being B-listers, but how's the voice acting? Well, the voice acting is probably on par with the first game. You have a bunch of returning voice actors like D. Bradley Baker, Catherine Fiore, is that how you pronounce it? And Rino Romano. It goes to show you the importance of professional level voice acting. The conviction and energy that these people put into their performance is professional and top notch.
All right, Chuckles, you're gonna tell me everything you know.
I ain't telling you
I thought you'd say that.
Rino Romano is still possibly my all-time favorite voice of Spider-Man. Smarmy and sarcastic, but is able to flip the switch at a moment's notice, and the rest of the voice actors do an incredible job. D. Bradley Baker's portrayal of Electro absolutely steals the goddamn show. He sounds like such an unhinged and desperate psychopath.
There must be something you are not telling me, good doctor, and I want to know what it is. Give me the jewel, Spider-Man! Give me the jewel! Or this one dies!
Furthermore, that's a voice that I can only describe as little bitch. Considering how many characters each voice actor plays, for all of them to sound distinct and filled with personality, it's very impressive. So honestly, I find this game narratively to be over the top, absolutely cheesy and ridiculous, filled with a bunch of great voice acting, compelling plot points, and decent writing, all contained with a strong framing device that's built on rather well. While I don't particularly find this a big deal, Enter Electro fixes a lot of what I didn't like about the first game narratively, while still keeping many of the better aspects, enough that I can generally enjoy it top to bottom. The same can't necessarily be said about how the game plays, however. There are a few repeated themes throughout the game from the last game, but Enter Electro definitely feels different tonally, but I'm not necessarily talking about the tone of the story, I'm more talking about the tone of the gameplay. In the first game, where you had many fast-paced, exciting sequences, as well as borderline inept design between all the swinging and the wall crawling, here both those things are done away with by and large. Although, unlike Neversoft, Vicarious Visions are capable of writing a halfway decent story, like with Crash Nitro Kart, for example. Seriously, what was Neversoft's best story? Tony Hawk's American Wasteland? Talk about being the tallest midget. That's probably why they always focused on gameplay so much. So Enter Electro fixes a lot of my major issues with the first game, only to make way for more issues, and this brings up an interesting philosophical quandary. Is it better to be bored or irritated? Because that's the big difference between the second and the first game, respectively. Well, I guess the answer will come in time. So Enter Electro is pretty well identical to the previous game in every way. I've heard claims that the controls are less responsive than in the first game, but I've never found that. In fact, I'd argue that the controls are slightly more responsive here than in its predecessor. So what is this game? Well, it's a 3D beat 'em up with Spider-Man elements mixed in. You have two types of levels: outdoors, where you're free to swing around and navigate at your own leisure, and indoor levels, which are much more claustrophobic and linear. You have various combos at your disposal using the 3 attack buttons: punch, kick, and web, and there's a whole heap of functionally samey but visually varying combos, which makes the combat satisfying through variety, and the sound design is thankfully very heavy, so you get the same wince-inducing viscera that separates the good beat 'em up from the bad beat 'em up.
Your swinging days are over! You're dead!
That's what I call satisfying combat. Plus, the copious amounts of little touches like the visual impact graphics also makes the combat rather impactful, and that really is the word. It's just fun to punch the things. Also, the Spider-Man aspects of the combat are mixed in gracefully, giving this game a familiar but ultimately unique combat system that separates it from any other game in the beat-em-up genre. The web can be used on its own for various effects depending on where you're pointing the D-pad when you're attacking, from shooting people with a bundle of web, creating an explosive web cocoon, yanking them, or even just holding it down to tie people up if you're feeling kinky. Here's a question. Do you guys think that Peter Parker ever used those web shooters to get, you know, freaky with Mary Jane? I mean, I would. The web attacks are your most useful attacks at a moment-to-moment basis, because if they're not a one-hit kill, they do AoE damage with the potential to push aerial enemies off their perch. That said, because of your limited web fluid gauge, you're limited on the amount of web you can use at any given time, and it's even more limited as you go to higher difficulties, and you have to save some for the web swinging mechanic, as that uses some of your web fluid as well. So it's a really nerve-wracking balancing act. You could just tie up that drone, but you're wasting web fluid that you may need later. We're going down, mayday, mayday, mayday! We're going down, mayday, mayday, mayday! We're going down, mayday, 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 mayday! Heh, bitch. And thankfully, the soundtrack is just as kick-ass as before and adds excitement to the gameplay arguably just as well as it did before. I say arguably because that just depends on what you're into. Where before the soundtrack had a clear post-grunge nu metal influence, this game's soundtrack has more of an electronic aesthetic, which I can get behind because it still emphasizes the chugging guitar riffs along with that, resulting in a nice mix. So these pieces are generally enjoyable, but they tend to go for more subtle music if it's a stealth level. but then when it gets going, it kicks not an unreasonable amount of ass. Pieces like the training theme, Burglary Interrupted, or the epic Enter the Webhead. These are the standouts, but most of these pieces are well composed. But there is one more that stands out though. Gangland.
Why does this sound like filler?
So top to bottom, Enter Electro is pretty much a perfect copy of the first Spider-Man game verbatim at a base level, so let's cut to the chase. What is the difference between this and the first game? Regardless of my opinions of the first game, Neversoft were the kings of fast-paced gameplay, especially seeing as they perfected arcade skateboarding gameplay, so discounting how obnoxious the design was at times, the first game consistently inspired you in one way or another to keep the speed up. They did this in different ways almost every level, and if they didn't do that, there was probably a good reason. Vicarious Visions, while skilled developers even back then, have never had fast-paced gameplay down quite to the same degree, so the pacing and general design of this game feels much more methodical than the previous game. It had a lack of urgency and just feels less exciting as a result, where before you had timed chases, exciting escape sequences, and various other pixel-perfect timed sequences, you have button-pushing sequences, climbs where you can theoretically fall down as many times as you want, and casual swinging through linear or open environments. One thing that really stands out for me in this game from a design standpoint is that where the previous game had an instant death fetish, this game has a climbing fetish. The amount of levels that involve monotonously climbing samey section after samey section at one point or another is ridiculous, and furthermore, there's one level in particular that's obnoxious because it goes on forever, but also because half the scene architecture is non-interactable, though you can tell what is and isn't interactable simply by asking the question, will it kill you instantly? There's one level in particular that tries to make you do this overcomplicated climbing and swinging sequence, but thankfully I can literally just hit the L1 button in the right spot, which is the web to the ceiling button, so guess who just skipped to the key part of the level without wasting 2 minutes of tedious swinging? Booyah! It's poor design, but I'm not complaining. I'd rather cheese the game than climb for ages. It's not a bad gameplay system by any means, but the pacing just isn't as good. To use a Spider-Man simile, Enter Electro is like old Peter Parker from Into the Spider-Verse, where the first game is like young Peter Parker. One's slow, lazy, bloated, and out of shape, and the other is young, fast-paced, and exciting, but also fucking dies.
I'd have warned you about spoilers, but that's your punishment for not having seen the movie sooner. You numpty. Oh.
There are some levels that inspire you to keep the pace up, but even they don't feel as urgent, or you get cases like the hangar level, which is probably the most obnoxious level in any Spider-Man game full stop. You have to use imprecise controls, crappy aiming controls, and a terrible camera to web a plane's propellers, but in such a way that you get them evenly, otherwise it'll turn too far and crash. Just from sheer not doing what I wanted the game to do, this level took me a dozen tries, and I only just barely succeeded in the end. The same goes for this climb to reach Electro, but that one's more tolerable for a number of reasons. Most importantly, you don't have to restart in one hit. Another particularly frustrating level is the first Sandman boss fight where you have to catch the train. If you have a perfect run, you can only just barely catch the train, but you have to deal with several sand walls from Sandman and Sandman himself like every 10 meters, and the throwing controls don't really work that well. Half the time it'll blow up in your hands, sometimes you just can't aim in the direction you want, and sometimes Sandman will respawn on top of you, which will destroy whatever you're holding. It's a case where the timer only serves to annoy. It's heart-pounding for sure, but for all the wrong reasons. It's like having to walk down a street, but every 2 steps you're kicked in the shins. Doable, but painful to get through. In general, this game has a hard time with the pace, and it's mostly overly leisurely, but when it's not, it slips into its old obnoxious sneakers, and it's a shame that this game doesn't feel as urgent as it should for a superhero game, because there are some really cool additions that really bring this game to life more than the previous game could ever dream. They build full city environments for you to swing around and stumble across thugs doing crime before progressing to the next area. It brings a surprising free-flowing nature to that level that almost borders on self-contained sandbox. There are a number of these levels where you're given an open environment, a main goal, and how you get from A to B is generally up to you. Do you swing in guns ablazing? Do you stick to vantage points and take pot shots? Do you lure people away and take them out one by one? Freedom within logical constraints. Just how I like it. Even though there's no big obligation to do so, I really enjoy just swinging around these environments that they created, and exploring has its benefits. Just like before, you have hidden collectibles and unlockables for the connoisseur, but you also have some gameplay additions like the electric web, web, ice web, and so on. Functionally samey in regards to the regular web shot, but also adds an extra oomph to the webbing, which is always appreciated. Freezing minor enemies and shattering them, or making drones explode, these are things that never lose their appeal as a spectacle. Speaking of the web, there's something I didn't really make note of until now. That's because swinging from place to place isn't a major part of the gameplay, it's more of a means to an end than anything, but the web attaches to the sky. Obviously this was because they didn't have the technology to have web attached to buildings yet, but it's something you really just take for granted, even though it is kind of absurd. I find it funny, like there's a helicopter just out of view that follows Spider-Man around that he webs to. Thankfully the web travel is a one-button prompt, so it doesn't take that much guesswork. If your destination is within 2 web swings of distance, more if you get an upgrade, you'll automatically swing to it and attach if necessary. It's surprisingly responsive and is probably the most accurately controlled thing in the game. While moving around, there's always a degree of inaccuracy to the movements, so tight spaces are nerve-wracking, but swinging onto them are easy. Sure, it's automated, but without the ability to gauge where you're going, accurately controlling web swinging would quickly become needlessly frustrating. The only time where it becomes unresponsive, in theory, are where there are things that are just out of your reach, and that's not the game's fault. I never had an issue with it, and in terms of adding a bit of Spider-Man-iness while being an intuitive and useful mechanic, the web swinging does the job really well, and that goes for both games. And you can also go into manual aiming mode if you want a more specific target, activated with the press of a button, so that's also useful and well implemented. The wall crawling is, well, probably the most boring base mechanic. It's so plotting, but it's a case of, well, what did you expect? The only time you really need the wall crawling is in the stealth levels, and I find the stealth is actually better realized in this game than most games of this era. It feels more organic much of the time, where you're given an environment and are told to go nuts, and if you fuck up the stealth, you're generally not chastised too much. In particular, this train yard sequence is one of my favorite levels in the game, minus the backtracking you need to do to flip switches, but surprisingly, this level has a fantastic espionage atmosphere, and atmosphere hasn't really been something I've been able to use to describe these games. Sneaking around to this dark train yard, taking out unsuspecting enemies from the top of a train car is a very enjoyable time. Thankfully, the idea is to jump off the train car this time. Granted, this level is an outlier more than anything, but is easily the highlight of these games from a stealth perspective and really showcase how good the stealth could be. Oh my god. Spider-Man's a vampire! Which is funny because the other stealth levels, in particular the levels that are indoors, are just as bad if not worse than they've ever been. These games just aren't well made the moment you have to go into an enclosed environment. In those cases, it's just like the previous game. The really damning flaws are much more prevalent. For instance, the rather unresponsive controls. The controls are perfectly fine when you're fighting, but the moment you have to move with any sort of accuracy, all that goes out the window as you start attacking away from people who you're intending to fight, or the controls flip while you're wall crawling, or the controls just blatantly not responding. Then there's the camera, which is quite frankly awful. There's no way to control it on your own, so it locks the moment you have to throw the first punch, meaning you'll often find yourself fighting or interacting with things that are entirely out of your view. Not having proper camera controls by 2000 was ridiculous, but by 2001 it was simply egregious. Plus, this game, like the first, runs at a sub 30 frame rate generally, so it can't help but make the controls feel all that more sticky. Half these indoor levels have hostages as well, meaning if one dies, then you instantly fail. I'd say the police are putting an awful lot on the shoulders of Spider-Man if you can't miss one hostage, especially if they're running away like that. I mean, most police officers can't pull off saving all hostages in a hostage situation. You'd think 1 or 2 wouldn't be that big of a deal. Overall, these indoor sections are where the game's biggest flaws really come to the forefront and are multiplied 10 times over. They're not terrible per se, but they definitely amplify the negative aspects, but I'll accept taking pot shots at 30's goons from the ceiling over dealing with something like the symbiotes any day of the week. You thankfully never have to deal with anything that annoying, although even at this game's most silly, it's actually quite grounded, at least compared to the first game. More guys with machine guns than malformed atrocities. The enemy variety is still lacking though. You're introduced to a new enemy every few levels at best, and very rarely are they that different combat-wise. They all punch you up close and shoot you from far away, but as ever, the only thing that really matters is that under my fist they all look the same, and gratifyingly crumple like ragdolls filled with ground beef, and that's certainly true for Enter Electro, though some might feel a little bit uncomfortable in that one of the reoccurring enemies are, well, you know.
Sound the alarms, Twitter. We have potentially problematic things from decades ago to get arbitrarily angry about. We shall not focus on real issues today.
With all of that said, are these levels fun? Yeah, I'd say so. The combat is weighty enough and they do enough interesting, if not consistently entertaining, that these levels are better than the sum of their parts, and of course you can always play through in what if mode if you're not sold. The highlight for me being that time you ride through a level on a giant banana. Seriously, I cannot stress this enough. More games need a what if mode. Then you have the various costumes, powers, and alternate scenarios to unlock, and all of that combined makes for a surprisingly replayable game for how short it is. There's one more thing we need to cover though, the bosses. On a whole, the bosses are a big step up from the previous game. While they were good, they were a little bit cliche, like the charging enemy that you had to make run into things. If not, they were very standard, like with the Scorpion boss fight. They take the gameplay here and spin it into some pretty interesting and fun fights. The Shocker boss fight, and I can never get over that name, is clever. You can't damage him properly in the traditional fashion, so you need to use your environment, though aiming is a bit of a bitch, but it's still fun nonetheless. Furthermore, the warehouse is in the process of burning down, and he has attacks that will get you off the ceiling if you're hiding, so there's an impressive attention to detail, and had the web yanking as well as targeting worked slightly better, this would be top notch, although I didn't know about the sideways yank until later, so that one's on me. You have the Hammerhead boss fight, which starts out inside the penthouse where you have to make Hammerhead vulnerable via gun yank while dodging his charges and bullets. Then he gets you outside and you have to continue your attack while being shot by him as well as a helicopter. Later you fight the Lizard where you have to hack into a computer to create vaccines. The better you do, the more vaccines will be available to you later in the fight. Then Lizard bursts through the door and you have to frantically go all over the lab looking for the correct web fluid power-ups to make him vulnerable before bashing the hell out of him.
Stop giving him vaccines. Oh my god, you're being cruel. He needs healing crystals. You're gonna make him autistic.
Though isn't it funny how in the last game he had control over this, but now he's a slavering beast? Makes you think. Later you have a proper rematch with Sandman where you have to use water valves to weaken him before taking him out. Then you have to fight Electro, and honestly it's pretty lame because it's more of a battle of attrition more than anything. What I do is just web to the ceiling, then drop kick the fucker like Ricochet off his meds, then punch him until he inevitably activates his AoE attack to push you off, and thankfully that does little to no damage. Even when he activates his frickin' laser beams, it makes no difference, but the final boss, the rematch with Electro, is suitably epic, damaging the towers he uses to recharge, making him vulnerable via weird generator type things. It's pretty awesome. The only thing that's kind of annoying are these mines. Tricking Electro into making himself vulnerable requires precise timing, and these mines knock you down for just long enough to miss your timing quite frequently, so that's a bit balls. Otherwise, it's a meaty, properly climactic fight with enough balls to keep in the air to make it a worthwhile and satisfying conclusion to the game. What really makes me like this set of boss fights is that they all use the core gameplay in a slightly varied way. Pretty much every boss fight, Electro Phase 1 notwithstanding, uses the environment in some way that's unique to that boss fight, so they switch things up from the standard gameplay without it all being the same. Honestly, pretty impressive. Then from there, game over more or less.
This goes to show that good wins because evil is dumb.
Motherfucker, did you just misquote Spaceballs?
The ending is honestly pretty lame. It's kinda sudden and just has Spider-Man swinging away with a brief visual cameo by Thor, but there's a pretty good reason for that, which is that this game had some very last minute changes, and I mean last minute. Remember when I said this game came out? October 2001. Well, I shouldn't have to tell you about the tragic events that took place in September of 2001, and no, I'm not just talking about Nickelback's third album. To say that Enter Electro was the only piece of media to get altered because of the tragic attack on the World Trade Center would be far from the truth. It wasn't even the only Spider-Man media that was altered, as one of the key scenes from the first Sam Raimi movie was removed at the 11th hour. It's not something I want to dwell on, but for what it's worth, several set pieces related to the World Trade Center were cut, some levels renamed, like the Gauntlet was originally called Aces High. Actually, that should read sorry. As well as the true ending being changed, which allegedly had Spider-Man and Thor interact in some way, and the World Trade Center was apparently involved in some way. I don't know. There are copies of this game in circulation that cost a little bit more than the average copy, where many of these changes are still left intact. Most significantly, how you genuinely fight on top of the Twin Towers instead of nondescript, weirdly shaped skyscraper. But we play the cards we're dealt, not unlike Hammerhead, and this ending feels like a massive fizzle as opposed to the big blowout that this game was building to, and that was the last hurrah of Spider-Man before Hollywood would go on to have a hot potato match with the IP, and the video game portion of the franchise would go on a roller coaster of quality.
And that was Spider-Man 2 entering Electro's butt.
This is definitely a conflicting game, but not in the same way as its predecessor. The entirety of the gameplay consists of things being swapped around in a number of ways to varying degrees of positive or negative effects, and overall, I like it better than before, and I like it better than Spider-Man PS1. Of course, the controls are still unresponsive at the best of times, you can't control the camera and it locks on you, and so on, but the improvements are still more prevalent than the detriments, even if this game doesn't quite have the same excited pace as before.
So yes, I would go as far as to say that I like Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro, and I like it slightly more than the first Spider-Man PS1 game.
It has its flaws, but is better than the sum of its parts, and assembles its parts in a slightly more appealing way than the first Spider-Man PS1 game, in spite of having some weaker aspects. And, well, in terms of the Spider-Man PS1 duology, that is it. And in terms of Spider-Man, well, I'm gonna take a break from Spider-Man for a while because, well, I have much bigger fish to fry. Well, that is until I want to relive my PTSD with Web of Shadows PS2. Damn you, Activision! This video was brought to you in part by my lovely patrons. I thank you for your continued support. If you want to become a patron for TGX, the link is in the description. Aces high! Hail the rhyme of the submariner, see his eyes as he stops one of three. Spider-Man is already wanted by the police, so what does it matter?